Welcome to another episode of Mindful Drawing with Rooks is Fun. I'm Robert, and as always, I'll be leading an exercise through the space of drawing that is less of a tutorial or how-to, but more of a opening up of the potential we have when we engage our mind with our hands and eyes and this medium of pen and pencil or paper to see what kind of worlds we might craft. And in crafting those worlds, I'm going to draw today from my experience in architecture and the types of drawings we might do to help us create a three-dimensional space for imagining our designs. And we'll just work with some parallel lines connecting at their corners, forming rectangles and parallelograms in space, and see where that will take us as we begin to unfold these newly crafted worlds and let our mind think into them and find dimension and hopefully a little space for our imagination to explore and enter into something new for the day. Grab your sketchbook or a piece of paper, your favorite pen or pencil, maybe a crayon or a marker, and come along with me and let's draw together. Maybe it's a bit of a setup, just an introduction to the format of having a three-dimensional grid in space, but we don't have to follow it for the overall drawing. But in many ways, this just allows us to start to develop a few lines in intersecting parallel directions. So on a small piece of scrap paper and a new page in the sketchbook, I'm just going to draw a few kind of vertical lines across the page, giving them an even or uneven spacing, can jump around or produce a consistent rhythm. Just starting to feel out how you might be interested in drawing today. Is it a organizational moment or a chance to let them things be a little freer and just let that arm move through space? And as you begin to fill up a good vertical area, we'll turn our hand and work in a diagonal. It can be any angle, just working back into space in a roughly parallel fashion. The lines can wiggle and wobble a little bit, just filling up some space in another axis or direction. And using this time to bring some attention into the arm and how it moves in a sweep out across the page, or if you're drawing towards yourself, it kind of pulls across the page. And as that starts to fill up, also drawing in a counter direction to that, another series of parallel lines. And it can be at any arbitrary angle. There are techniques around this to craft certain types of projection and perspective, but any three kind of opposing angles and rhythms of parallel lines will set up a grid work that we've done an exercise before. You can draw into and find, for instance, surfaces, and those surfaces can peel around and become parts of other surfaces. And it slowly establishes a kind of grid work for moving between axes. Something a little bit random like this will often need further influence or input to start to make things look three-dimensional, if that's a goal here. But it can also just establish planes of space. And as a little warm-up, that's where I think I will begin on a longer drawing. It's just taking some time to craft a little bit of a world by meandering through planes of space by using a similar principle or technique that is just to work in 3 related axes, but without establishing so much of a grid first, and just taking a moment to find the space on the page that feels comfortable to start a line, maybe bring something down vertical, shift that direction into another axis, starting to establish that same depth of space on the page, and working our way around just a bit of a skewed box to create that plane in space from 4 intersecting lines. And from there, choosing an edge and working off of it in another direction. Here, I'm working horizontal. That could be at an angle, like the warm-up, and completing another square. And moving to any edge and beginning to follow the same angles. Something that brings in a bit of our visual attention, though it's not too critical that we match the angles precisely, since those would just be planes in space with a bit of a different angle to them. And things can extend far. And as long as they're beginning to reconnect around these same horizontal, vertical, or diagonal axes, it'll start to create a feeling of space and depth. And you can pull rectangles back or down, getting into the technique of just completing small kind of rectangles at different angles, and getting a hold of that technique. We then can open up our attention to how this might begin to interact with space on a piece of paper. Does it wrap around a space? Does it create things that seem to be solid, or can they work in and out of themselves to be transparent? Using each new edge just to follow a new condition, tracking this as it moves around in space, and beginning to connect that rhythm that might be emerging on the page with our body's motion. So breathe out as you draw an axis, perhaps vertical, to reposition, and breathe out as you complete the rectangle or parallelogram in space. Each line now becoming the focus of our attention as we bring our breath just to each segment that can reach out and make these other planes by accumulating around the page, but they can also just exist for a moment with that breath, wrapping through these axes of space that we're creating on this page. beginning to shape that space with our breath and with a technique connected to our hand and our eye. Using some moments for longer breaths, extending deeper into the page, and perhaps other moments for shorter, more natural breathing in and out. Keeping the breath as the measure, so we can be in that space where we might begin to see things in the drawing, begin to feel a rush to complete them, but practicing that attention and awareness to ourselves in space by having our breath guide our motion, knowing that we've established some of the rules in this world here. So that we can just keep tracking the lines, connecting them around as planes, moving with our breath back into the space of the page or forward, out from the space of the page, finding new edges, and if the world has started to fill in, perhaps just choosing a new direction, following the same technique with the breath, with the motion of the pencil. Layering these planes in space over each other. Flowing out from the pencil or pen, out from the breath, each new collection of lines, recentering as a collection of breaths in, between moves, and out with the motion. Keeping that connection between what we can create out in this page and the way our body maps that creation as a series of movements between our hand and eye, between our breath and our motion. And perhaps the eye part of the brain begins to take over and wants to complete volumes, connect intersections in space. And that can be a time to just let it explore a little out of the way as it understands some of the relationships of planes and shapes overlapping, or if the space of the technique is challenging to follow, to use that as the moment of mindfully entering just how we begin a line in a direction, match that line with a neighbor a little bit over and a little bit parallel, and connect its two ends in a similar manner. To slowly wrap around and craft some of that space, and if certain angles start to twist off or converge, or just making planes with different shapes to them, different angles in space. It might be fun to play with when our eye sees them in 3D, and we just pick a direction and follow the kind of technique around parallel lines, meeting on planes in space. And if things start to fill up a little bit here in the space of the drawing, you begin to see some three-dimensional emergence or sinking in back into the plane. It can be fun to enter into the drawing with a little bit of further refinement of the parallel lines by emphasizing the direction of certain planes, using each one as a platform to bring further physical repetition in the motion of the body, and perhaps in connection back with that breath to bring it into our mind and attention again. Here where I begin to draw faster, just layering lines in the direction of a plane. It doesn't quite fit with my breath for one line, though that could be a good discipline and speed. It may also be that I can draw without having to do too much thinking, just repositioning and drawing in the same direction, giving myself that little bit of space to focus on an easy breathing in and breathing out, giving my body some attention to breathe at a natural rate, not needing to pull in too much, but not getting lost and forgetting to breathe in the tension of focus or excitement or struggle. And as the directions of these lines can flow along the surfaces to reinforce the movement in the drawing, they could also take on a characteristic of light or shadow, distinguishing one plane from another. To emphasize their edges or overlaps, the spacing or rhythm between the lines, creating greater or lesser darkness or intensity. Just setting a path for your hand and pencil in motion and letting it begin to fill in and seeing what emerges. And this time we have to be mindful of a bit of a technique, a bit of space between us and what we observe in the drawing. Perhaps even subverting some of the setup to see what happens. That we've crafted this world in a medium of expression that can allow us to explore both the technique of drawing, or with that technique that we've embodied in these few minutes, just crafting parallel lines, we can begin to find new worlds in here. Sometimes with structure, many of these techniques coming from a history of rules that structure a way of drawing so that we can have some reproducible representations, but that structure is always open for manipulation or transformation to create new possible structures within it. Unfolding and folding space. Opening, expanding our rib cage and our breath. Releasing, collapsing that space inside of us. Filling it in. And letting it out. And taking the next 5 minutes or so, just keep following the path of parallel lines that might move around and through and between surfaces. Having some fun and time to play with the rhythm and its separation or connection to your breath, maybe to a little bit of the motion of other parts of your body. If you can rock a little bit in the chair, or move a little bit beyond the wrist into the arm and the shoulder. Maybe remember that you have 2 hands and 2 arms that could potentially draw or just be engaged a little bit in the action. Perhaps just giving, in this case, my left hand, which has been sitting somewhat dormant, a little space to flex and breathe, to also be in motion. And this is a good time to check in with other postures of the body. Are you leaning, slouching in, as we tend to bring our awareness to one thing, others drop back. And perhaps we're pinching holding tight somewhere in the core and the shoulder. Let me breathe into that space. Let it resettle and reposition now that the application of the technique can follow its own route. It's part of our embedding of the process in this short time. We can give our body some space to explore it. That is as being active for us. In exercises like this, I like to take on the task of some of the larger or longer, more expansive surfaces, as they really provide me with a challenge to find a pacing or rhythm that doesn't get too rushed in trying to complete it, as it seems distant and daunting. To have some time to be in that space, that it doesn't have to happen too fast, that this repetition of parallel lines in a sequence with just a little bit of time, a little bit of breath, will build up into something larger, can begin to define the surface. I just let the technique, let the motion, the tracking between my eye and my hand unfold at a consistent pace. Soon, hundreds of lines build into this new little world for us to explore. Hopefully giving parts of our brain, whether at the forefront and in our conscious thinking or in the back, a little bit of a play space, a little bit of a pattern matching space to look in to what we might see here. Perhaps it's heavy and chaotic and wrapping, folding over, through and around, intersecting. Perhaps it's highly organized and structured. And what can we read into that space? Through new layers of lines and drawing, can we bring it what we might need right now? We can organize it with these surfaces, or we can subvert it, make it playful, break some of the rules of the technique. And having some time to observe how we react or feel to what we've created. And having some detachment or space in the drawing to sit with that for a moment. Or just have a little fun and play with these parallel sequences of lines tracking through space. And we're approaching the end of the session. Perhaps taking a moment, again, just to stretch the hands, spread them very wide, take a breath. in to build pressure, and then let them relax as the breath goes out. Turn them in to build pressure and relax as the breath goes out, and return to a natural curvature that's been twisted and compressed around the pencil. And a little wiggle of the spine back and forth, perhaps. Coming back into our space around us. Going on to the next parts of our day. As we draw to a close, I thank you for joining along and participating in this adventure to craft a new world from what we can do with our hand and our breath, a pencil and a piece of paper, to discover something that might be within us and present it out into the world to engage with it and work with it in a mindful practice of drawing. Wherever you are in your development of your drawing technique and skills, it is hopeful that these practices can introduce you to some new ways of working, ways of thinking that you can take with you anywhere to take a moment and relax. These can be done longer form, like these 20 to 30 minute exercises, or like any of the warm-ups. You can do them quite quickly in just a couple of minutes, and perhaps preparing for a meeting, riding on the subway, or just starting your day by having a few moments to expand what might be inside out through your breath and the hand onto a piece of paper and see what it might be. Sometimes that world for me is a chaotic mess of doodles. Others it is something structured and rigorous to explore a form or an idea. Either one helps me put down things I might see inside of myself or inside of my mind's eye and give them another dimension or another bit of distance and detachment from being held in an imagination to being expressed outward in a possible world. In doing these exercises each week, I'm always reminded of my childhood in the earliest forms of connecting dots or just trying to draw dinosaurs or something else on a piece of paper, to coloring books and manuals on techniques that I found fascinating at the art store or the bookstore that I'd bring home and try to emulate. And each day, in meetings or on phone calls or just sitting in class taking notes and maybe halfway paying attention, filling pages and pages with doodles that help organize or structure my thoughts. And each of us will have a different interface. Perhaps that interface is writing or meditation or counting a mantra or breath. For me, it works best as drawing. The flow out from myself onto the page is something I'm always grateful to have available, and also relish in the transient nature that is a continual flow of potential information or just organizing clouds of lines. I hope you found this practice engaging, or at least kind of fun and maybe playful and helpful or informative. If you do, please give it a like below and add some comments about what you feel while going through this practice. Let me know if there's other things you'd like me to explore. Wherever you are and whatever you're doing, draw well. Thank you. It's fun signing out.